I to welcome you to panel 2, Archival Silences. We're here at 2:40 Eastern Time or 11:40 Pacific Time. Our first speaker is David Luftig, who is science librarian at Washington State University. The title of David's talk is Seeking Lost Histories, Issues Regarding Preserving Historic Agricultural Resources. David, if you want to go ahead and share your screen and take it away.
All right, everyone can see my screen. Everyone can hear my voice. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for hosting this conference, inviting me to present. This has been a fantastic conference so far, and I'm really honored to have a little area in which to present at it. So I can't thank you enough. My name is David Luftig. I am the agriculture librarian at Washington State University, which is a land-grant institution within the state of Washington. Since I took my job in 2019-ish, as an agricultural librarian, I've really tried to balance these sort of heady concepts of assisting our ag researchers here on campus, and also trying to deal with the sort of legacy of agriculture and colonialism in this state especially, and sort of try and not be part of the historic problem. So I've been really trying to strike that balance since I arrived here on campus. But my presentation today is going to talk about the preservation of scientific agricultural resources within the United States, or more specifically, agricultural extension resources, which I'll define and describe in just a moment. I'll also talk about their importance and the history and considerations regarding preserving these sorts of resources. The presentation is centered around the argument that, one, it is important to preserve agricultural documents, it is important to make those resources discoverable, and diverse voices make for better science and more accurate histories. I don't think any of those arguments really need to be supported. I think they're pretty self-evident. This presentation talks about extremely complex issues in the briefest of presentations. As such, this presentation really provides only an overview, and I feel like I already have to apologize for what I neglect to mention, and those things I just mentioned briefly in passing. When talking about the creation and preservation of agricultural resources within the US, it's essential to remember that agriculture within this country has been linked to a real grotesque legacy of colonialism and genocide. As I'm sure we're all aware, Native peoples in the Americas were often forced, while looking down the barrel of a gun, to sign treaties stating that they would give up their language, their homelands, their cultures, and typically turn to farming, often on inhospitable lands, which are far away from their ancestral homes. More often than not, settlers moved into these vacated spaces, farmed, and raised livestock. But agriculture and horticulture was nothing new to the original peoples of the Americas. They've been practicing things like selective breeding, soil science, land management, ecological best practices, animal husbandry, and so much more for millennia. This slide that I'm showing you right now, it's the map of a region which is called the Palouse, which is where my university and my home is located. The Palouse is one of the top wheat producers, is the top wheat producer in the United States. It's also home of the Nimiipuu people, who are the victims of the US government doublespeak, which resulted in their land being drastically reduced, even after treaties were signed by some bands of Nimiipuu, but not all, which is an epic story in of itself. In this space that was taken, 2 land-grant universities were created, my own Washington State University and the University of Idaho, which is about 7 miles down the road. Of course, when we're talking about this legacy of genocide and colonialism, we cannot ignore the fact that Europeans also brought slaves to the Americas. Many of these people brought their own agricultural knowledge with them from Africa, and also learned about agriculture and farming within the brutal conditions that they faced in the fields. For some of these slaves personal gardens provided a sense of security and agency that was typically not found elsewhere at the time. During this time, seeds could be stashed away and growing instructions could be covertly shared. Sometimes, though, these gardens were in the open. Some slaves even had the ability to generate income based on what they produced in their gardens. Also, when talking about this brutal legacy of agriculture in the US, one cannot overlook the impacts of misogyny in the household, on the farm, and in the proverbial halls of science. So, although agricultural documents date back to really the beginning of the written word, I'm going to start this presentation and frame it around the experimental agricultural stations, which got their birth in Western Europe in the early to mid 18th century. I'm starting here for several reasons. First is a method that was imitated within the Americas, first by colonizers and then by Black farmers and scientists, and is still utilized today. This is also the catalyst for the development of land-grant universities, which utilize this system, which I will talk about shortly. I should note there's a caveat that there's always been independent authors and researchers within the United States that publish agricultural documents away from these scientific halls. But that said, the agricultural extensions and research stations were really the center of agricultural sciences within the American farm. This is demonstrated by the unprecedented veracity in which extension documents have been created, the amount of federal and state money and support provided, and the scope of the extensions, both in geography and in subject matter. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. So going back to Western Europe in the 18th century, there begins to be this development of so-called agricultural experimental stations, which were essentially plots of land in which scientists, chemists, what have you, could utilize the scientific method towards plant and animal sciences. Typically, this research was collaborative and funded through the governments or universities, and the research was intended to be shared with locals so that they could improve their own farms and gardens. This became the model of the United States government, as it was clear early on that successful agriculture meant the overall success of the United States. So these practices were adopted. With the Civil War in the United States, it was quite clear that agriculture was in for a major change. In 1862, May of 1862, Lincoln signed an act establishing the U.S. Department of Agriculture. This coincided with the Morrill Land Grant Act in July of 1862, which, and I quote, was an act donating public lands to several states and territories which may provide colleges for the benefit of the American agriculture and mechanic arts. So this essentially created land-grant universities within every state with the intention of those agricultural research programs helping those citizens of the state. The Emancipation Proclamation was issued on January 1st, 1863. The Hatch Act of 1887 provided federal funds, initially $15,000, to each land-grant college in order to create a series of agricultural experimental stations. Providing agricultural extension soon provided resources not only for dealing with farming, but rather extremely large scope of contemporary subjects such as gardening and cooking, nutrition, home maintenance, child development, sewing, folk arts, youth activities, and even as a news service. Providing such resources was especially important in a time where travel was difficult and information was not instantaneous. Within these extension programs, there's typically county or regional agents that worked with both universities and local citizens. These agents disseminated literature, answered questions, visited practitioners in public spaces and on their own homes. These agents could evaluate a farmer's crops or soil on site, as well as answer other questions. In 1890, the Morrill Act was the second Morrill Act was created, which was intended for mostly those southern states, the ex-Confederacy states, which stated that race, which required states to demonstrate that either race was not an admissions criteria within their new land-grant universities, or that there was a separate land-grant university created for people of color. This 1890 Act, as I said, was typically aimed at southern states, which many of which chose to have a separate university, a separate land-grant institution, instead of integrating their own land-grant institutions. And thus we have are 1890 institutions, which are a lot of HBCUs. This predictably did create a separate but unequal extension system. As white universities and by proxy, their extensions would have more money, resources, and freedom to provide extension services to the public. That said, it did create a legacy of Black extension services that provide very unique and applicable research to a population that was typically either ignored, harassed by local or state governments. I'll talk more about this momentarily. Finally, it's important to note that by 1994, land-grant status was issued to tribal colleges. It's also worth noting that these land-grant extension agencies are still active today, producing up-to-date research and highly localized support. So today, extension programs come in many forms. Common extension programs may include things that you've heard of, like the Master Gardeners and 4-H and SNAP-Ed and many region-specific programs. Over the years, there's been an incomprehensible number of extension resources created. For example, within my university, Washington State University, which our extension program was created around the turn of the century, but didn't really get going until about 10 years after that, we have created at least hundreds of thousands of pages of documents for our extensions, and maybe even quite a bit more than that. These documents are quite varied and include chemical information regarding pesticides in Eastern Washington. Here's an extension bulletin about growing tomatoes in the Seattle area of Western Washington. Here's a really fun radio transcript from a cheeky program called Garden Sass, which provided rural news, homemaker tips, recipes, and gossip. This was broadcast on the extension radio station. Here's an extension bulletin regarding tires and travels, an internal memorandum intended for our extension agents. Here's a DIY pamphlet for our bulletin intended for DIY clothing clubs. Here is a home economics publication that deals with how to repair washing machines. Here's a 4-H document. So as you can tell, there's been a vast amount of documents created, even from within a single state, and those documents can tell us a lot about what was going on in that state, not just within the farmers' fields, but within their communities and their households as well. Expectedly, the experiences and output of extension programs of 1890 institutions and their agents was unique. For example, some issues that were commonly addressed within these extension agents that were not common in the typical white land-grant institutions involve issues such as how to get the maximum nutritional yield from traditionally the worst plots of land in town. This led to the study of and the utilization of crops such as how to grow sweet potatoes and peanuts, experiment with different types of poultry and plant grafting. Also, there was the birth of the popular use of organic pesticides. George Washington Carver of Tuskegee University realized that many Black farmers would not have the money to purchase fertilizers, so they created their own fertilizers, which he labeled barnyard fertilizers, which were typically organic and more ecologically safe than the counterparts. Extension agents, Black extension agents, also uniquely understood the synergistic relationship between Black farms and the sense of stability, agency, and resistance within the community. And this would be carried over and supported during the farm co-op movements and the urban farming movements. Furthermore, this extension work done by these 1890 institutions was done in extremely difficult conditions. These colleges, institutions, and the agricultural extensions and their agents were typically understaffed, they were underpaid, and they operated often in the South with a sense of open hostility and racist ideology. This chart on the right demonstrates some of the inequities of two similar jobs and the inequity of payment for those jobs. But there is a proverbial silver lining, as extension programs provided. There is the silver lining is that these Black 1890 institutions provided information and resources that were very unique and provided exclusively to an underserved population, which might not have been supported in those northern universities that did not have a 1890 institution looking out for them. Because of these issues, Black extension programs and agents typically utilized a mix of their own published literature and the USDA and other universities' literature to assist local farmers and communities. Predictably, this information sharing only tended to go in one direction, but there was a lot of really unique, really valuable extension materials created by these 1890 institutions. Because of these factors, less extension resources were typically created than in the typical land grant institutions, which meant that less of these resources would be preserved, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Another quick caveat that these 1890 institutions are still providing unique contemporary support for local and global practitioners, and they publish extension documents regularly. So here's a couple of examples of 1890 institution extension documents and bulletins. Here is a Tuskegee Institute bulletin from 1906, which was written by George Washington Carver, which details sweet potatoes. Here's another one about rural schools and gardening programs within those schools. But for the most part, the research done by 1890 institutions and the extension bulletins and resources they created were ignored on a larger scale by the larger land grant institutions. And this caused a homogeneous research, which created many problems. Homogeny in agriculture has created, and I could go on, like I could list a million different things, but some issues that arose from this is there was a sort of value of profit over the environment and the communities that lived therein, and also not recognizing environmental warning signs such as climate change would be a really clear one. There's a lack of support for local farmers, especially those of color, that comes from a sort of lack of diverse voices within agriculture. There is this birth and the creation of large agricultural companies who had little influence and presence within their communities. There's a mistreatment of laborers, we see a homogeny of crops, which led to a vulnerability to crop failure, and there's really quite a bit more. As I have a couple of Washington State University extension bulletins that talk about the pesticide DDT, which is now globally banned, but was once universally sort of accepted, at least within those predominantly white land grant universities. It took the troubles of this pesticide was first recognized very early on by a female farmer who got little traction in her resistance. As she observed after it was sprayed on her daughter inadvertently by some planes overhead, and then her livestock and her children got sick, and she tried to fight this with little success. Rachel Carson, who's a marine biologist's book in 1962, Silent Spring, called attention to this issue of DDT, and eventually led to a global ban. But I'm just sort of kind of laying out sort of this homogeneous problem as an example of problems with homogeneous agricultural research and ignoring voices that might not fit in the mainstream. So there are current trends with recognizing historically excluded voices, both within the US government, within land grant institutions, and with public as a whole. For example, there's been more of an awareness of what is lost when diverse voices aren't represented. This has led to a greater push for issues of DEIA within the government and the agricultural research field as a whole. We're seeing, especially in my institution, more of a true collaboration between extensions and indigenous peoples. We're seeing trends to utilize Indigenous knowledge regarding land use, whether that be Indigenous fire preventions, benefits of native crops and plants, issues with dismantling our dams to allow for salmon and other fish runs. We see a broader interest in Black farms, farm co-ops, urban farming. There's been more of a development within our extension documents to address issues of farm labor. And I know I am running out of time, but there's also been issues that have explored how grants can more commonly assist issues of preservation, especially with these unique voices. Real quick, for example, I'm working on a grant. I'm the chair of the project series committee. Traditionally, this committee has provided grant funding for cereals that have been created by land grant institutions, but we are now starting to recognize that the preservation of cereals might not be possible for traditionally marginalized groups who might not have had the abilities to create serials of agricultural publications. So we worked with Navajo Nation Department of Water Resources to change the scope of our grant to provide grants for all issues of agricultural resources, not just stuff that might be cereals and traditional agricultural resources. I'm happy to speak a lot more on this. Here's some information about further readings and my contacts. I flew through all that information, but please let me know if you have any questions. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, David. As a book historian interested in the production of any kinds of printed texts, I'm so excited to ask you specific questions in the Q&A to hear more about your project. Our second speaker is Elspeth Olson. Elspeth Olson, M.A.M.L.I.S., is the Outreach and Public Services Archivist at the University of Nevada, Reno. Prior to UNR, she worked at Stanford University and the American Bookbinders Museum. The title of Elspeth's talk is Mind the Gap, Addressing Archival Silences. Go ahead and take it away.
Probably helps if I unmute myself. So I am, as said, my name is Elspeth Olson. I am here to present on a proposed way of addressing archival silences in special collections instruction sessions with university students. So as we all know, item not found can mean a number of different things. Things can be misfiled, misplaced, happens more than we all care to admit, I think. Some items get deaccessioned, whether that is to be discarded or to be moved to a new institution, or in some cases, repatriation, as we and other institutions have done or are in the process of trying to do in our efforts to comply with the protocols for Native American archival materials. Some things have inaccurate or insufficient metadata. There are always going to be legacy finding aids with different documentation standards, unprocessed collections, sometimes with basic records but no details, cataloging and processing errors. I mean, we're only human, right? Obviously, there's also fatal deterioration. We always hope that there are going to be used copies, but not everything gets caught in time. Thinking of things like vinegar syndrome, corrupted digital files, stuff like that. We also have to acknowledge the presence of theft. It's an unfortunate truth of our world, and things that are missing are not always noticed right away, and not everything gets recovered. I've recently been listening to the book The Map Thief about the case of E. Forbes Smiley III, and I've been thinking a lot about the ways in which his thefts changed the standards of reading room security across our profession. But what I really want to talk about today are the things that you would expect to find in collections that were never there to begin with. As you may have noticed, or maybe I just noticed because I work there in the map in the previous presentation, UNR is a land grant institution. And we have a couple primary collecting scopes. We collect book arts. There is a small press on campus that does a lot of really wonderful work. They actually come and use our collections quite a lot. Obviously, we collect the history of the University of Nevada, and we have a geographic focus on the Northern Great Basin, Northern Nevada, and Eastern Sierras. We look at a lot of land issues, environmental stuff, recreation, agricultural, general public land issues. I mean, so much of Nevada is controlled by the Bureau of Land Management. This is just a natural issue for us. We look at the history of the region's people and places. We look at Nevada politics. And in particular, we look at the region's industry, especially mining and railroads. UNR, as part of Reno, is less than 30 miles from Virginia City, which was the hub of the Comstock Lode mining frenzy in the latter half of the 19th century. Reno was also one of the first big stops east of the Sierra Nevada mountains on the Central Pacific Railroad line. The Central Pacific linked San Francisco to Reno in 1868, and the Virginia and Truckee Railroad, which was specifically designed to haul supplies and ore between the Comstock mines, Carson City, and Reno, broke ground in 1869. So there are things that you would expect to find in our collections that are related to both of those industries. This is a little picture of our reading room set up for a class. Last semester, an Asian American history class booked a session to introduce students to the archives and give them a chance to work with primary sources. And though our staff has been aware for some time that our collections are disproportionately white focused, locating materials for this class really brought it home in a very specific way. We don't have much on Asian Americans and their experiences in this region, and what we do have is quite fragmentary. Compiling the pull list for the class highlighted this very unexpected gap in our collections. Transparency in what we do and don't have and why that might be is part of understanding the curation of the historical record and learning how to do primary source research. In particular, one thing really stuck out to me in trying to pull things for that class, and that is that we have basically nothing on Reno's Chinatown. I myself grew up in California, and one of the main things we learned about in 19th century state history, starting in elementary school, was the role of Chinese laborers in both mining and railroad development. And when I came to Reno in 2019 to work at this university, I was very surprised by the dearth of records on that subject area held by the university. Other than a few side mentions in old newspapers, which are really difficult to find unless you know exactly what date you're looking for, Reno's Chinatown is entirely absent from our collections. So at this point, I'm going to give you a very brief history of Reno's Chinatown. It really started to take root around 1868 after that completion of the Sacramento to Reno leg of the Central Pacific Railroad, and it grew with the creation of the Virginia and Truckee Railroad. Virginia City, that mining hub, had its own Chinatown district as well, and we do actually have a few items, mostly photographs of that area. Reno's Chinatown burned down in 1878, officially by accident, but coincidentally on the same night as the local Working Men's Party met to discuss and adopt resolutions on the Chinese question. I'm not aware of any proof of arson or not arson, but you know, it's clear that anti-Chinese sentiment was as present in Reno as elsewhere in the Western states and territories. The rebuilding plans forced the residents of Chinatown to move to a different part of the Reno-Sparks area, as you can see from this clipping from the Reno Evening Gazette in 1878. And in 1908, the Reno Board of Health claimed that Chinatown was a hotbed of disease and vice, and a county grand jury ordered the district razed. It became this massive legal wrangle. The Chinese American community of Reno tried to sue the city, even contacted the Chinese consulate in San Francisco for assistance, but their suit was ultimately unsuccessful, and the district was largely demolished. That said, some structures remained well into the 20th century, but surviving structures slowly dwindled until the final remnants were removed in the 1970s to make way for a casino parking lot. 2 memorial plaques to the Chinese laborers do exist in the area, neither of which is in either of the Chinatown district's actual locations. There's one, the one on the left is at the Rancho San Rafael Regional Park. It is actually a picnic area with this little signage out in front. And there's one in Victorian Square in the neighboring city of Sparks, which has the distinction of being the only bilingual state historical marker in Nevada. So this is the challenge that I have set myself. Inspired by my experience with this class last semester, which is to teach students to read the gaps in the collections. I am relatively new in this role at UNR. I've been here for 3 years, but I've been in this particular position for about 6 months. And I have the opportunity to do a complete overhaul of our archival instruction program. We mostly get one-shots, so it's not really a very complex lesson structure. It's very much what you can fit into 75 minutes to 2 hours. And I've created a basic template of a lesson plan for working with classes on archival silences, which I have entitled, much like this presentation, Mind the Gap. And here is roughly how I plan for it to go. After a general introduction to the concept and making sure they understand how to search our various online platforms, I would want the class as a whole to brainstorm the topics that students would expect to find in our collections, either in general for a survey class or more specific if it's a very focused class like this Asian American History one was. We would then divide into small groups, and each group would search for a couple different things in our collections across our 3 basic platforms. And they would then discuss amongst themselves what they find, the presence or lack of materials on those given expected topics. After that, bring the class back together for a larger group conversation about what it is and is not in our holdings, why that might be the case, and whether they were surprised by what they did and did not find. Prompted and of course and encouraged by the archival instructor, probably me, and the course instructor itself. Aside from the useful research skills, this also has the benefit of being a lesson that I can easily take to the instructor instead of them coming to me, which is much easier for large classes as we have a very small reading room and no dedicated classroom space for the archives. This kind of lesson also fits very well within the primary source literacy guidelines, especially section 2. For those of you who may not be as familiar with this is a document created by the Society of American Archivists, and I highly recommend looking it up. It's very interesting reading. So section 2D in particular reads, understand that historical records may never have existed, may not have survived, or may not be collected and or publicly accessible. Existing records may have been shaped by the selectivity and mediation of individuals such as collectors, archivists, librarians, donors, and or publishers, potentially limiting the sources available for research. So of course, the main thing to talk about with these students initially is why materials they expect to find with us are not present. There are going to be some things that simply didn't survive the years, whether that's because of intervention like the Chinatown fires and building demolitions, whether things were made from more ephemeral materials. Again, using the Reno Chinatown as an example, it was not an especially wealthy district, so materials may have been produced from lower quality ingredients like lower quality paper that just hasn't held up as well in the intervening century or so. Some materials presumably went with the owners when they left. As the Chinatown diminished, some people moved elsewhere, presumably taking their personal belongings with them. And for those who stayed, families and businesses may simply prefer not to relinquish their historical documents to an archive. You know, we can't force anyone to give to us, much as we might want to build out that aspect of our collections. But there are 2 that I think are really important for us to consider as well in these conversations with students, and in the spirit of being transparent about knowing where we have screwed up professionally in the past. Curator bias is something that's always worth discussing with the students, I think. Collections reflect the people who compiled them. This is as true for the creator of the records as the archival curator. And as a result, all archives reflect the priorities and values of those members of staff who've decided what does and does not get accessioned and retained. We here are not happy that our collections are as wide as they are, and our collection policy is shifting to reflect that. But it's a lot of ground to make up, and it's going to take a while if we are ever able to really achieve the full representation that we would like to. There's also the fact that original owners of these materials may not trust us with their documents. SKUA staff in my department is at the moment entirely white. And given how the Asian and Asian American populations have been treated by white people in this country over the generations, distrust of our ability to care for the materials in a culturally sensitive and respectful way is entirely understandable. There's likely materials that exist that haven't come our way. There are a couple other points that I would want to highlight with the students if we had time in the conversation, which is that some materials are present but harder to find for other reasons. There are some things that are present but restricted. Some collections have delayed opening laid on us by the donor. You find that a lot with political collections. We have a couple that are in that stage right now, and they will not be opening for a few more years. So we have them, the records are up on our site, but they're not actually accessible without extra levels of permission. There are also legal restricted access to some kinds of data, FERPA protections, IRB protections of human subject research data. We are working with our university council at the moment to develop policies so that these things can be accessible. I always tell the students, we don't actually want things that are restricted access. It makes our lives a lot more complicated. We would like everything to be open. So we want to find ways to make this material accessible within the legal and ethical guidelines, which leads me, of course, to the ethical restrictions, such as applying the protocols for Native American archival materials, which is something that UNR has been working on for several years. There are going to be some materials that are present but buried. This is where learning really strong search skills is very important. Students accustomed to using search engines may not be as successful with database search platforms, which aren't as smart as your average search engine like Google, Bing, or similar. You know, they can't figure out what you mean. They only search for exactly what you put in. So part of learning to do primary source research is figuring out alternate search terms, ways to come at a topic obliquely, rather than simply hunting for materials with the exact title or subject heading that you're hoping to find. I've had several of these conversations very recently, and it's always something that makes me pull up short and reevaluate how I do things in terms of searching myself. It's good practice. There's also the need to search other repositories. Just because it's not held in our collections doesn't mean it's not anywhere. Not everything ends up in its home region, for example, and some areas have multiple local repositories. For instance, my department, the UNR Special Collections and University Archives, and the Nevada Historical Society are within walking distance of each other. And the Nevada State Archives in Carson City are less than an hour's drive away. There are also many smaller historical societies attached to counties or individual towns, especially in a state as rural as Nevada. So brainstorming other places these materials may have landed is part of the research process. I am very hopeful that I will be able to continue refining this as our collections evolve, because I believe that it encompasses a number of useful skills for researchers at any level of experience, especially those starting out on the journey of learning how to do this. Thank you for your time.
Elspeth, thank you so much for that presentation. I also have a lot of questions for you specifically about how to operationalize this for those of us who are working in collections that aren't complete. No collection is complete, so that's all of us. So let's move on to our third and final presentation for this panel. I think we're going to work on getting them. Here we go. Our final presentation for this panel is entitled Unpacking Archival Labor, Interrogating Our Practices, co-presented by Phan and Kacie Lucchini Butcher. Phan has been the digital and media archivist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison since December of 2016. Caring for and managing the born digital, digitized image and audiovisual collections of the university archives. And Kacie Lucchini Butcher is an award-winning public historian whose work is dedicated to building empathy and advancing social justice. She is currently the director of the UW-Madison Public History Project, a multi-year effort to uncover and give voice to the histories of discrimination, exclusion, and resistance on campus. So take it away.
Hi, everyone. Kacie here. Sorry, my video, it's not letting me share my video. But I'm here, so I'll just start maybe.
Kacie, do you need me to share the PowerPoint then, or can you do that?
I think I can still share my screen. Can you all see my presentation at least?
Yes.
Okay.
Or we can see your screen, but the
yeah,
presentation isn't up yet. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's okay. If I get to show my face eventually, I will. But if not, the presentation is what matters. I am here. So yeah, thanks so much for having us. Kat and I are super excited to be here. Really excited to talk to you about what has been like the kind of coolest. Oh, there I am. Okay. Hello, everyone. Kat and I have been really excited to talk about what has been one of the coolest projects that we've worked on in the past few years here at UW-Madison. And really it centers on this film. And so we wanted to give you a brief background about the film itself and how we both—
Quick interruption, Kacie. I think we're seeing your Google Doc and not your presentation.
Oh, okay.
And when you mentioned film, I was like, oh, there's something interesting I gotta see.
All right, let me just try sharing again. We did practice all of this, so of course there had to be issues. How about now?
There,
Looking
yes.
great.
Okay. All right, we're back. So yes, it all centers around this film. And the film itself has like a big life, a big history that we could spend probably hours talking to you about. But we'll give you the kind of brief synopsis, which is you are currently looking at stills from the film. So in 1961, through UW-Madison's Bureau of Audiovisual Information, there was a small group of filmmakers, graduate students, local kind of activists and community members who had been concerned about housing discrimination in the city for years. And they had this kind of bold, bright idea that instead of talking about housing discrimination, they were going to prove that housing discrimination was happening in the city. And what they did is for 3 months in 1961, they set up an undercover camera in the back of a station wagon. And they drove around the city of Madison and they filmed undercover people discriminating against Black folks trying to find housing. So the cameras were propped up in the back, they would go tour the houses, and what you see on film is these really bold denials where white people are denying Black people housing based on their race. And so it's this incredible kind of object, one that we think is extremely unique. We're unaware of any other film that exists like it in the country that really lays bare this issue of housing discrimination in the mid-century. The film, however, was restricted until April of 2021 when it was released to the public for the first time in a partnership that Kat and I formed between the UW Archives, the Public History Project, Wisconsin Public Television, and some of the families, the descendants of the folks who made the film. And in the process of trying to get the information about this film out, get it digitized, get it to PBS Wisconsin, get it out into the world, Kat and I faced these kinds of immense challenges that really opened all of us up to having conversations about archival restrictions, about copyright and ownership, about what the duty is of archivists and of historians when we come across materials like this, and really about like, what do we do when we're faced with this really interesting set of ethical questions that cross all these different fields and all these different stakeholders and people. So the backstory of the film, the afterlife. Kat and I will spend most of our time talking about its kind of current life in the past few years. I came to UW-Madison in 2019 and met all of the staff in the archives to direct this public history project, which was focused on uncovering discrimination and resistance at the university. So looking at the university's big history of discrimination and exclusion while also focusing on resistance. Was spending a lot of time in the archives, and my previous project was a housing project. It was a housing specialty. And Kat, we were having a kind of conversation one day in the archives. I was, talking about what I was researching, and Kat said, well, you've heard about the housing film, right? And I was like, no, what housing film? And that was that conversation that I think really snowballed and started, which is where Kat, relates to me that there was this housing film that had existed, but that it was restricted. And we had a lot of conversations after that about following through with this unrestriction, about challenging this legal restriction that was in place with the university archives and really the University Board of Regents. And so once we found the film, using and honestly, quite frankly, leveraging the power of the Public History Project, which is a chancellor initiative, we were able to kind of use that positional power to say, hey, this is a chancellor's office initiative. We believe that this film will help us in our research mandate to uncover discrimination at the university. We would like to be able to see this film. Once the film was unrestricted, which it is currently unrestricted, it is digitized and available, which Kat will talk about more. That is where we got into even more of these kinds of ethical questions about how do we display this to people? How do we talk about it? What is the appropriate story to tell? How do we use the film itself, but also a lot of the other surrounding archival materials to really make sure that we're not only highlighting the film itself as an incredible kind of archival object, but that we're also highlighting many of the collections that exist around it and highlighting our own kind of challenges and ethical conversations that we've had as archivists and public historians and community members. So I'm going to pass it over to Kat, and she's going to talk a little bit about the film's kind of life at the archives and about some of the more specific archival challenges.
Yeah, thanks, Kacie. So as Emily said, I'm the digital and media archivist at the University Archives at UW-Madison. And honestly, there's not much to say about the nearly 60 years of the life of the film from when it was restricted originally in the early 60s, and just lived its life on the shelf without anyone being able to access it. But thinking about this conference, thinking about our presenters this year, what we can think about is what was lost in those decades with this film sitting on the shelf and no one being able to access it because of institutional actions, because of administrative actions. So thinking about, just no one being able to access the film clearly was lost. The work of these filmmakers who put their work and labor into producing the film was inaccessible to them. The loss to the public and to public conversation and to patrons and researchers who might have done more with what they would have discovered if they had been able to access the film. And then also, our university archives, like many, do not, we don't have climate control currently. So there's sort of also physical loss that's happening to the film while it's not being able, while people aren't being able to use it. So there's a lot of loss happening in those years. And so what I think averted complete loss was the story of the film. So Kacie tried to give you a quick summary. Like Kacie said, we could talk at length about the origin and history of the film, but there was a big controversy because the university saw this, a rough cut was made and was shown to university administrators, and that's when they decided that they didn't agree with the sort of undercover techniques that filmmakers use to produce the film, and that's why they decided to restrict the film. Yeah, and sorry, I should mention this picture here before we move on. But so the film reels made it to the archives, and as Kacie said, restricted under seal. And you can see, I don't know how well it comes across in the picture, but all those red stamps just say restricted. But at some point during its life in the archive, someone at some point drew this skull and crossbones on the side of the box, which we're not really sure why or when it appeared. Maybe it was because of the background of the story and it just being restricted. Maybe, again, as I mentioned, just because of the degradation of the film, someone decided to draw that illustration on the box. But it to me and Kacie, that clearly sort of represented this visual symbol of like not wanting people to access this film. But anyway, so the story of the film, despite being restricted, it lived on, right? So like there was a lot of controversy. The university restricted the film. The people involved with the making of the film protested. There was a lot of publicity and controversy and protesting around that action that the university took. There was some confusion even that like people thought that the films were destroyed and burned. Clearly they were not, but there was a lot of publicity surrounding it. So, as I mentioned, I think the public demand was what averted this film from being lost entirely because the story continued. And over the years, people still wanted and wondered about this film and whether it was accessible. So fast forward to 2018, I am now on staff at the University Archives. And because I'm the media archivist, I get passed on a research question, and a documentary filmmaker has asked about the film. They, again, have heard about it in some way. And they were wondering what information we had. Do we still have it? Is it accessible? And so that's when I first heard about it, and I started looking into it. And learned about some of the things. Kacie did a lot of research to learn more about the details of the origin of the film. But what I also learned about it is that, not only the public knew about the story, but staff here knew about it too. So that the reaction was kind of like, yes, we have this film. We have it. It's on our stacks. But it's restricted. And there are other archivists in the area, other film archivists who also know about it. And they were like, yes, you all have it. It's restricted. And I think for me, like thinking about it, reflecting on it now, I was just like, it seemed like just having the word restricted on it was some sort of froze people in some way. It was like, there's this, case closed, it's restricted, we can't do anything about it anymore. But for whatever reason, maybe it was because I was new to the archives, I just decided to challenge it and say, like, the restrictions don't make sense to me. Let's see if we can remove them. And really all it took was an email to compose an email to say, like, listen, this is the history of this film. And I contacted our legal counsel and said, this is the situation. We don't believe that this restriction should be in place anymore. Can you look into this? Can we remove it? And are there any implications of removing restrictions to this material? Fortunately for me, our legal counsel did not make it much more complicated for that. And it took them a while to look into the situation. The main point of concern for them was privacy, honestly. And so back at the time, early 60s, the filmmakers and the universities did not violate any privacy laws. Like there was no reason, that was not a legal reason to restrict the film at the time. But our legal counsel said today there are privacy laws in Wisconsin that they just wanted to double check that there wasn't anything retroactive that we would have to do before releasing the material. So that took them a while. So eventually, unfortunately, too late for this original documentary filmmaker who contacted me. They had moved on with their project, but I got a response back, and they communicated 2 points, basically. One is that the university owns this film and we can decide what to do with it. And two is, yes, we looked at all the privacy laws and other concerns, and you can remove restriction to this film and provide access to it as you do other archival materials. So just thinking about that, I've been reflecting on that, and clearly it's good news. In case, clearly you probably knew that the restrictions were removed. We've released it, as Kacie said. But I had a couple of thoughts on this. And one is the ownership piece has been complicated for me. I'm not going to argue legally. It was a work for hire. It was university staff who created the film. Like, that is not a point of dispute. But there are other complicating factors that I think for me complicate this question of ownership. I mean, clearly they're the filmmakers, like the individual staff members, who, one of the filmmakers, by the way, resigned in protest of this film being restricted. Lloyd Barbie, who is a legislator, he raised film. He was the president of the NAACP at the time. He actually raised film, and he was instrumental in getting this film made. So there was gift funds that contributed to making this film. And then also, like, the subject of the film is on a community, and what say and how should they be participating in decisions about what happens to this film. So that ownership piece was complicated. And then second, of course, the restrictions were released. So clearly this was good news for us. And then it was serendipitous timing with Kacie. And then, like she said, the Public History Project was really leveraged to move forward on removing the restrictions and providing access. And Kacie will talk more about this sort of next chapter in the life of the film. But I will just reiterate what Kacie said, was that it really sort of made us think about restrictions, how we think about restrictions, like what is our responsibility as an archivist to just sort of accept or question or criticize or challenge the restrictions that we have. And I just also want to reiterate, I am no way like criticizing or like saying my past, future, or present colleagues did anything wrong, because these are really complicated, and challenging the administration is not an easy thing to do, especially like we have a lot of early career professionals, you know, thinking about positionality of your position as an employee of the institution too. And lastly, what I will say before I pass it back to Kacie to talk about the next chapter of the film is that I do want to mention that we have the rough print digitized, and we've put it up online. So it's up online in our open online collections that anyone can go look and view the film as they please. So I'm going to pass it back to Kacie now to talk about the next chapter.
Yeah, so once the film was unrestricted, we worked to get it digitized with PBS Wisconsin, and we were really lucky that PBS Wisconsin was open to a partnership with us. They actually paid for the entirety of the film to be digitized. Their only request was that they wanted to do some sort of event around it, and they were hoping to get some type of programming out of it, which for Kat and I mean, all of you are archives people or archives adjacent people, we were like, yes, absolutely. If you're going to pay to have it digitized and we can still put it up online and all you want is an event, which is what we want too, great deal. But Kat and I immediately in that kind of process, I think we're both like community practitioners. We're both people who think really deeply about relationships between history people, public history people, archives, and community, and how there's a history of fraught relationships there that have led to a lot of distrust, and people haven't always been good actors or ethical actors in these spaces. And we wanted to make sure that if we were going to go forward, that we were communicating really clearly with the descendants of the filmmakers and with one of the last living people who worked on the film. So in this picture, the man sitting down here, that's George A. He's the last living person to have worked on the film. He was a graduate student at the time when they were working on it. The woman standing directly behind him and to the right in the black beret, that is Lloyd Barbie's daughter, Daphne Barbie Wooten. And she wrote a book about her father's life, and the film plays a prominent role in the book and played a prominent role in family lore. And so when we had, found the film in the archives or working to get it digitized, we were in constant communication with Daphne about the film. And really what we wanted to do was work with her and with George to make sure that if this film was going to be put out into the world, it was done in a way that they felt comfortable with. And any time that we kind of talked to Daphne, her resounding thing was put it out in the world. My dad wanted it out in the world. People want this thing out in the world. The filmmaker who retired in protest, his son also had the same reaction. I called his son. We had a great phone conversation, and he came to the event. Daphne also came to the event where we aired it on PBS. And he said the same thing. My dad would have wanted this film to be out. So as long as you're showing it, that's kind of what we want. So we tried to keep them really like in the process with us and really trying to honor, I think, a lot of their wishes for the film as some type of repair. But that's one of the really complicated questions for Kat and I that we've reflected on a lot, is we did what often feels like the bare minimum, which is challenging a restriction, which was, as Kat said, sending an email and kind of name dropping the public history projects, making connections with PBS and really like leveraging those. But like, we feel like we didn't do that much for what is 50 years of harm, for what is a really solid amount of time, when you can ask a lot of questions about how the city would have been different if this information is out there, how these families' lives could have been different if this film hadn't been restricted, what seems like a mountain of harm, and we did something very small. And we've talked about also feeling conflicted about, like, the families have thanked us repeatedly, and like, we are employees of this institution that did this harm, and here we are, 50, 60 years later, trying to make it right, trying to do the right thing, but being thanked as still being representatives of the institution. And even when we do conferences like this, we're always like, now we're kind of being representatives of the film, but like, are we the right people to be representing the film? And so we're still in kind of constant, questions about wanting to do the right thing, wanting to kind of rectify some of the wrongs that were done in the past, but trying to think about how we do that ethically and how we give this film a life that meets, I guess, what the filmmakers would have wanted, and all we know from what their families want of this. This picture is actually from our project was mandated to do a physical exhibit And so the film played a prominent role in the exhibit, which was something we worked with the families on as well. And so this photo is actually from opening night of the exhibit. We jokingly said that opening night was the film premiere for the movie. We invited the families to come, and this photo was from that night. And as you can see, George was sitting here in this kind of little room where the film was playing, and he was like holding court, telling stories about it. And people like loved that. They thought it was like an incredible way to kind of connect with these two people who had a really close relationship with the film and the filmmakers. And I think it added a kind of depth, obviously, to the exhibit experience, but also for them to see it kind of come to life in this public space, which is what they've always wanted. But we've still been having these kind of, I guess, complicated feelings, not only about like the archival processes, but also about how we do good community work in the face of a lot of harm that has happened in the past that we can't always fix, or that we can't fix in the ways that we want to. So I will leave it there so that we can move into kind of question and answers, but thank you so much. Kat and I love talking about this film, so.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. Clearly the chat is as excited as I am, and as excited as you gals are about the work that's been going on with this film and its debut. I have so many interesting questions to try to get at. So while I'm waiting for people to put in their personal questions into the chat, you can use the Q&A function and I can read them from there. I'll start with a few of my own, and we'll get the ball rolling here. David, I wanted to give you a chance to talk more about what your institution. I know that you're part of some initiatives that are trying to do something about these undercollected, underproduced and undercollected ag extension documents that came from BIPOC communities, Indigenous communities. Can you tell us? I want to give you a chance to say something about what you're doing now, because I think that we can relate that to kind of what some of the other panelists are doing about outreach or making teachable moments. So can you give us a little update on what you're up to?
Sure. A couple of different things. I work with a couple of different ag collectives and grant agencies and consortiums of agricultural librarians. So a big part of it is trying to understand how we sometimes inadvertently have set up barriers regarding what we support and what we fund as far as preservation goes. We also want to be respectful and understand history and understand that there's no obligation for these BIPOC communities to work with us, to preserve their records with us, to share their records with us. In fact, they have many reasons not to. There is just a large history of us either ignoring them or worse. But some of the things that we are doing is we are, like I said, we are changing the scope of what we fund. We are reaching out to more communities with these sort of diverse agricultural resources. We are sort of redefining what agricultural resources even mean. But really, also a large part of it is just, yeah, growing partnerships and trying to understand how we're viewed and how we can assist communities, on their sort of, where they're at. There's this history of us, thinking that we know everything and we know what's right, and this goes back to the archives as well. So a lot of it is sort of leaving our egos behind, accepting, how we are promoting a legacy of colonialism and brutality, and still trying to do good work within that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess one follow-up question is, are these predominantly historical? I know some of the examples you showed were just these lovely profusion of like mimeographs and typewritten things, and kind of DIY looking, smaller publications. So are most of these from 20th century?
Yeah, most of them would be from the 20th century, but really at the beginning stages of the 20th century. So a lot of you know, a lot of those like 1890 institutes actually started producing extension documents around then. So places like Tuskegee University have extension documents that predate the turn of the century. But most of these documents, I mean, these extension agencies are still being producing these documents. But yeah, a lot of these documents are pre-war or wartime documents, which also have a really unique perspective in them.
Elspeth or Kat and Kacie, do you want to talk? I know Kat and Kacie, you just ended your presentation talking about like the responsibility of representation and representing the stories that you are. Do you want to share some more musings on that?
I mean, I tend to think of it in terms of, you know, when I'm feeling grandiose, I say that archivists curate the historical record. And I think that's fair to some extent to say. And I just want to see our collections represent the population that is in our area. I mean, if our collection scope is this area, it should be more than the white colonists. You know, we do have a lot of stuff that is of, you know, indigenous in origin or about the indigenous peoples, but because we're trying to really put into place the protocols, we're having a lot more of layers to the facilitated access. I actually have this lesson plan that I was talking about scheduled for an upcoming class in May on an African American history class. And it's going to be more of that area where we do have things, but they're buried and they're harder to find because they're not necessarily mentioned by name or, you know, with the subject headings that you would try to find. So it requires students coming in with a lot of prior knowledge or are really developing their search skills. But, you know, we want to be welcoming, we want to be representative. We want to really make sure that the history of this university and this region is accurately documented as much as we can.
Yeah, I'll add on the like storytelling front. I think one of the things as like a public historian who happens to sit in a very academic history department, is that like public historians and public history as a field, one of the things I like about it is that we're not as obsessed with authority. And so you get a little more like creativity. So like when we were curating the exhibit and when we were doing these events and like I've written about the film, I just went to the filmmakers' families and said like, hey, I'm going to put this in the exhibit. Is this the right way to tell this story? Like, do you agree with what I'm doing here? Is there any details you think I should include that are interesting? And like got notes from them. So it was like an act of kind of co-curation. And so sometimes I think the way that like historians work with archives, right, is very like, I'm the authority, I'm going to extract and tell this story the way that I want to tell it solely. And that's my authority. That's the thing I'm doing as a capital H historian. And I really hate being like the final line on anything. I don't like that authority position. And I like what collaboration can open up and do for us. And so like, whether it was me and Kat collaborating on like, okay, how do we do this ethically? How do we make this event work? How do we, you know, work with the families, or like collaborating with text and an exhibit with the families as well. That kind of like open exchange, I think, is like really useful and makes the work better in the end.
The only thing that has come to mind was just thinking, I mean, and I'm going to make Kacie talk a little more maybe, but just in general, like her charge for researching the topic that she was given to research the history of resistance and discrimination on campus. I mean, there was so much in the archives that we don't have, right? So that like the entire public history project was met with this challenge of, yes, we have these collections that are so white and just don't have materials on the people that I'm trying to share, you know, the stories of the people that I'm trying to share. So that Kacie has run into that a lot. And I don't know if you want to say any more about that, Kacie.
Yeah, it's like interesting because I mean, this is like a lot of archives people. And so none of this is like surprising, right? Like you're all like nodding like, yep, your archives are really white. But it was interesting to have this charge of like, we want you to cover marginalized groups. And like, it wasn't just not, non-white communities. It was also like discrimination against LGBTQ folks or folks with disabilities, religious discrimination. And it was interesting when all of our public products came out last fall, for the most part, we would get the same critique. There's not enough about this community or that community. And every time I would say there isn't, and here's why. And like people who aren't in the archives world or like the history world, you could see these light bulbs where they're like, oh, well, then we need to like make sure we're doing that now. Like, let's make sure that we're archiving these communities now. And so I think it's actually opened up an interesting conversation on our campus about like, okay, well, we can try and go back and like, we'll do oral histories, or like we're building, we're trying to build relationships with like Black Greek letter organizations so that maybe, people will donate stuff or know that they can if they want to. But like, what about today? Like, are we working with Black Greek letter orgs today to make sure that we don't have this problem in 50 years? It's opened up that conversation, not just with like me and Kat, who are always already having that conversation, but like the chancellor's office has asked us, like, what's our plan to make sure that in 50 years, we don't have to do the same thing, right? So like, that's what I think, like, it's been interesting to have those conversations at like even the highest levels.
I will, there's a question in the chat that's really great, but while we're on this kind of thread of things that aren't there, something that in Oakland University's collaboration with UCLA, institutional lore played a large part, and it sounds like Kat and Kacie, that also played a large part in your situation too. Like, there's this box with a bunch of stamps on it, and oh, you don't know about the box, you don't know about the restricted box. And David, maybe you have something similar, that maybe you didn't walk onto the job knowing that there was this kind of a suppressed and undercollected set of documents where you were at. Can you all talk a little bit about the role that institutional lore plays in maybe carrying on or telling stories about loss, or pointing to a thing that isn't adequately described or accounted for otherwise?
We have one person in our department who knows where everything is, just sort of like off the top of her head. Like, we're a small department. We have like under 6 full-time. We lost a lot of people over the course of the pandemic time. And so, I am concerned, if this one person were to depart, like, we would not physically be able to find a lot of stuff, and we wouldn't know necessarily what was there. I mean, to some extent, I actually take issue with some of the standard conventions for naming archival collections, because they are so generic, and it does make things a little bit harder to find when you're looking for some of these specific things. But in general, yeah, there's always that institutional knowledge, and it's a problem. People retire, people go to different jobs, and you lose that specialized knowledge of specific collections.
That's definitely true in our archives too, Elspeth. We still contact the former archivist and say, do you know about this thing that we couldn't find in a finding aid, or whatever. So I don't think that's uncommon. I think what I was trying to say in terms of the film, I think institutional lore helped actually it survive in some way, because people kept asking about it, and like not just staff, but like the public knew about it. And so even though there was this sort of, again, some confusion, that people thought the films were burned, and people thought that they weren't existed anymore, but still people but there's this whole story and this myth, like what's going on with it. And I think it took nearly 60 years, but eventually we looked into it and were able to open it up and provide access. So I think in that way, the sort of institutional lore helped, I guess, in that story.
Yeah, I'd go on to say that in my institution, and Washington State's kind of a unique state in a lot of different ways. But we're sort of changing our mindset from like BIPOC, and especially like indigenous resources. Like, there used to be almost like and this is well known, like sort of paternalistic, like we're going to protect these resources for you. We are going to arrange them in ways that we think is most beneficial. And that was sort of our institutional structure, but we were getting away from that. Now we're getting with more collaboration. We have an online portal website, which is pretty much run by the NIMIPU, the Nez Perce people, and they can contribute to it. They can specify like what is behind a login and what's not. But really what I'm getting at is this sort of we are having to recognize how even in our best intentions, we sort of contributed to this legacy of racism that even with the best intentions was still detrimental to those who are impacted.
So cycling back to the question that we skipped earlier, and I actually think that Elspeth and David, you in particular, both mentioned something along this lines, but one of our participants has been asking about adding your thoughts about adding or changing descriptions to make these records more findable. This participant's having ongoing conversations on inclusive description. I know, Elspeth, you talked about the notion of oblique searching as a useful teachable moment. And David, you've got actual people who need access to learn how best to grow their gardens and create their own food or their own crops. So what are you thoughts about increasing access points?
Oh, I'm all in favor. Finding aids are living documents. They're always going to need updating and adjusting. Language changes, terminology changes, how we search for things changes. I mean, the only really big issue with it is just, do we have enough people on staff with enough time to do these projects? Between all the positions that are empty and all the collections that keep coming in, we don't necessarily have the space in our workload to do the reparative description, to do the inclusive description that we would want to do. I would love to see this happen, but we've only got one processing archivist. And we're about to celebrate the university's 150th anniversary, so a lot of stuff's going to be coming our way. So, there's aspirational, and then there's what you can actually achieve with the resources you have. But it's definitely something that I think that all of us here at UNR want to do.
Yeah, I mean, that experience is pretty similar to our own. With the extension documents, there's just been so much created, and what was created probably at like in Ohio State or Minnesota is probably even eclipsed what was created in my institution. So we have problems of what gets digitized and preserved, and then also like how we describe it, how we make it discoverable, and how the need for it to be discoverable changes. For example, we are now getting researchers who are looking at our extension documents and starting to suss out climate change issues that have been sort of talked about in these extension documents, but not necessarily being the topic of these extension documents. So how do you make this data findable to these current researchers, So yeah, really with us, it's like student workers are a godsend. We have grants, but I mean, I got a grant recently, or a couple of years ago now, and we digitized maybe like 30 or 40,000 pages of materials. And, it was a really in-depth project. And just to make that information findable is a whole other project in of itself.
There's a kind of ongoing theme that's related in the chat about the notion of priorities when trying to do this kind of reparative description and maintenance. And Kacie and Kat, you both mentioned something really interesting about, in your particular situation, you were able to leverage the chancellor and say, hey, this is in line with the strategic goals of our institution and this ongoing project that you're supporting. Can we relook at this particular restricted case? But there's something to be said about protecting, kind of transitory labor or precarious labor, and junior faculty members from putting them as the people who are petitioning these administrators. I was wondering, if any of you could talk about those kinds of communication structures of, I don't know, the difficulties of trying to communicate what we can do with what we have versus what needs to be done in that kind of lateral movement up and down the, food chain.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was kind of like a right time, right place situation where like, Kat had just gotten this email in 2018 and then I started in 2019 and I happened to do housing. And then it was like, oh, well, like, my project is a chancellor's office initiative, which gave us protection and cover from many of the challenges that we face looking at these, difficult histories about the university. So it ended up being like a right time, right place. But also, I think that we were able to kind of lean in to the privilege that we had, which is that, I can say, hey, this works for the project. You've mandated me to do this. This meets our requirement. We should do it. Right. And I will say, like, the priorities, right? It's just the way that the project was kind of commissioned and everything, the archives weren't really like consulted as like, hey, are you guys like cool with this? Do you have the extra like time and people and money? And so our project also took like a huge weight onto the UW archives staff of like, now we have all these graduate students who are showing up and researching. We pulled 200 cubic feet in 2.5 years. That was like extra. And this took priority, right? Where like we would say, hey, we want to challenge this restriction. And it was like, all right, let's do it. Let's like send the email, right? Which took away from like other emails that Kat had to send for other projects that were ongoing. So I think it's like, yeah, as a project, we tried to be really sensitive to like our partnership with the UW archives. And I think like one of the things that's been really positive about it is that like we have tried in every way to make sure that whatever we were doing for the public history project benefited the archives in some way, whether that was like making sure that people knew the archives were there or like helping to promote events or like, now we're in the process of making the project permanent on campus. And we're advocating really strongly for more archival support in the form of like a student life archivist who will help with like documentation, but will also help with other support in the archives. So like, we're thinking through how our relationships can be more collaborative and less extractive as well, which is, I think, is also part of that like power structure too.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that other than, thinking, I think it comes back to what I try to do, because, you can do what you can do and we have control over what you can have, is just think about what, like Kacie mentioned, what privilege and power do you have in the position that you're in? And so, and everyone, I mean, not everyone, I mean, you probably have some sort of power, maybe not as much as the chancellor's office probably, but in your position, what control do you have over the choices that you make, whether that's like what collections you choose to process or how much time, or you choose to spend more time on a collection that has implications with the community that you may have to work with them more. And I think that's what I feel like, where I can make choices and use the power that I have to give that student group who doesn't have a lot of power more power in the work that we do, raise their voice, give them a platform.
David or Elspeth, you want the final word on this?
No, I mean, it's great because I hear people articulating what I go through in a much better way than I do. So it's encouraging to hear not only you all facing the same sort of challenges, but you all crystallizing it in a way that is really succinct for me.
Well, thank you to all three of our presentations, to all four of our presenters. Thank you all for sticking out with us until the end of the panel. We'll see you bright and early tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Pacific time. That's 12 p.m. Eastern for those of us lucky enough to get to sleep in. Thank you for joining us, and we'll looking forward to seeing you tomorrow.